Rashidi has been coming for Soul Vibers Nation Reality Speaks for years. He's a good friend. Many of you see him on Facebook. He's always on there putting information, using Facebook for what it's supposed to be used for, not using it just to ask people, yeah, I'm hungry, it's lunchtime, what should I eat, Facebook? You know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? But putting out information, knowledge, and inspiration out for our people. He's a scholar. He's been working with Ivan Van Sertima, Dr. Ben, and many of the great scholars all over the country. So I want you to give him a big round of applause for Brother Runoko Rashidi.
Good evening, everyone. Instead of just talking about how vicious Europeans have been towards us, for the most part, I tried to show images of black people in these parts of the world so that it wasn't so completely one-sided. But it didn't occur, and what I wanted to talk about, or what I did talk about, was black-white relations for the most part. I didn't talk about our relationship with other Asians. And what I really didn't talk about, and I want to mention it just briefly, is how Europeans have treated one another. For example, in May, I went to Poland, and I also naturally took advantage of the opportunity to visit the National Archaeology Museum in Warsaw, or the Archaeological Museum. But I made it a point to stay in Poland, I think, 4 days, which is a long time. As Buddha Baruch said, it's not good to stay in a white man's country too long. And Poland is really a white man's country. It's like 99.9% European. You don't hardly see any Asians. You just don't. And you hardly know black people. But I also went to Auschwitz. I went to the concentration. I wanted to go. Right. As an African historian, I wanted to have that experience. I wanted to compare it to some of the dungeons and what have you. So I went to Auschwitz. There, it's in a community called Owisum. And the actual death camp was called Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz-Birkenau, too, because that's where most of the killings took place, most of the exterminations. I have great sympathy, unlike some folk, for what happened to those people. And I went to Owisum, I took a bus, and I was just amazed at what I saw. It's like Disneyland. It's like a carnival. It's all about making money. And they charge people exorbitant fees to go in the concentration camp, to see where the people were exterminated, to see the criminal. I couldn't stand it. I got on the bus and left. I would not have thought Jewish people would have allowed their history and their culture to be commercialized that way. People were eating hot dogs and smoking cigarettes and playing loud music and laughing and joking. And this is from Auschwitz. This was the major death camp, or the extermination center for the Nazis. And you know, in some of these concentration camps, there were black people themselves, particularly in Dachau. But anyway, I just wanted to show you a few more pictures. And this, of course, makes me think about how Europeans have treated each other. So a brother who was somehow ended up in Spain, and he was stuffed by a taxidermist, and his body was put on display. And some people think the body parts are still in Europe right now. Around the beginning of the last century, it was very common to put what Europeans regarded as inferior people on display. Even some white people were treated like that. For example, there's a famous story of the Elephant Man. You may remember that Oscar-winning film. A man named John Merrick who had all kinds of physical deformities, and he was put on display. Well, Europeans had a thing about that during the time of Victorian England, and they would put people they regarded as inferior on display. So this brother, this San man, was put on display, and that's what he looked like. That brother I showed you was actually a San brother that I met in Namibia, Southern Africa, a few years ago. So after his body had been in a Spanish museum for almost 100 years. And this information was brought to light during the Olympic Games that was held in Spain some years ago. The African athletes were making a fuss about this brother whose body was still on display in a Spanish museum. So they raised so much hell, there was so much pressure brought to bear on the Spanish that they took the body off display, and supposedly they shipped it back to South Africa. Now, I was in Southern Africa, at least. I was just in Spain a couple of months ago, and I was talking to some sisters and brothers, and they believe the body is still there. But this is the official burial site. He was taken supposedly from the museum in Spain to Botswana, and they call him El Negro, or the Negro, because they don't know his name. and this is where he was buried in Botswana. So I wanted to show you that. And let me see, I wanted to show you some other pictures. Ah, this is a good one. This one, this is Fort Jesus. There actually is a dungeon called Fort Jesus. It's in Mombasa, Kenya. And it was a dungeon where enslaved Africans were kept by the Portuguese. This is El Negro's grave. This sister is from a group called the Herero. And there's two groups, two big groups in Namibia, the country that used to be called Southwest Africa, the Herero and the Ovambo. And the Herero revolted against the Germans. The Germans, the Dutch, and the Belgians were the worst. They were by far the most brutal of the enslavers and colonizers. And the Germans tried to exterminate these people. Even if they tried to surrender, they would not accept their surrender. They would exterminate them or drive them into the desert. And these sisters and brothers have the best case for reparations. I think the Germans are going to be forced to pay these people some money. You know, now the first time I went, my body would not allow me to go down inside the dungeon. It was like there was an invisible barrier that was in front that wouldn't let me go down. It took a long time for me to be able to force myself to go into dungeons. And the first dungeon I went into was the women's dungeon. And there's a space, there's two big dungeons in Ghana. There's Elmina and there's Cape Coast. And they're both horrible. I think Cape Coast is probably the worst. And there's a place there, first of all, the way the women were treated. One place, you have a bunch of cannonballs, these big, heavy cannonballs, and women who refused to be raped would be chained to those cannonballs out in the noonday sun, and they would keep them there until their spirit would break, okay, for many of them. And others, there was a special room made of stone, and they would keep these sisters in there until they died. There was just a little slit for food, because they didn't want them to starve. They wanted them, the Europeans wanted them to live, so that they could be an example to the other women. If you refused to be raped, they would put you in there until eventually you would just wither away and die. And here I am with this young sister in front of one of those dungeons, the entrance to one of those dungeons in Ghana. And in every one of those places, you had a special dungeon, but you also had, I thought this was a picture of a church, because each one of the big dungeons on the west coast of Africa, there's a church in every one. Okay. This one is from Nigeria, and this just shows the capture of the city, the great city of Benin, and the plunder that the British were able to take from Nigeria. Most of these artifacts are still in European museums now. Auschwitz showed that. Showed the San brother. This is what they look like. They're called Bushmen in the pejorative word. And years ago, I would have said they have Asian features. Now I would say a lot of Asians look like these sisters and brothers. Oh, I keep coming back to that. There's still a couple that I'm missing, and I want to show you them, because there's one that to me beggars the imagination. Oh my God, what happened? Ah, here it is. I'm going to show you two more, and then we can have a question and answer period. Maybe three more. This is Gorée Island in Senegal, and this is called Slave Island. Now, there were apparently many of these places, but there were some that were really big. There was about 6 of them where the Africans were kept. Gorée Island is one in Senegal. I already mentioned the 2 in Ghana, Cape Coast and Elmina. In Benin, you have another big one, a fortress called Ouida. And then you have the 3 in Nigeria. The one I couldn't think of is called Badagry, that I haven't been to yet. And then there are 2 more. There's one in a place called Calabar, and there's one called Boni. This is one of the dungeons. I think there's 3 dungeons on Gorée Island, but they have an infant. They had an infant's dungeon. Now that's maybe the deepest part of all. They had a dungeon for the men and the dungeon for the women. That was always the case. They would separate the men from the women, and the women would be raped. And everybody would be branded with a hot iron. I think I showed you in the earlier section of somebody branding an African with a hot iron like an animal, like a cow. Gorée Island also had a dungeon for skinny people. I know I would not have been in that one. And they will keep you in there and fatten you up because you would be more profitable if they sold you. But they had a dungeon for babies. Now, I would not have believed that if I hadn't been there and gone inside it and taken a picture. If you had told me that, I would have said, no, that's not possible. No people could be that cruel. But they had a dungeon for infants.